On a moonless night high above the vast Indian Ocean, a South African Airways Boeing 747 Combi aircraft sliced through the darkness. Inside, 140 passengers settled into their seats, unaware that this routine long-haul journey would soon become one of aviation's most haunting mysteries. It was 27 November 1987, when Flight 295 lifted off from Taipei, beginning its long voyage toward Johannesburg with a scheduled stop in Mauritius. Most travelers were South Africans returning home, joined by passengers from Japan, Taiwan, Europe, and Australia. Everyone expected a quiet, uneventful 10-hour stretch across open ocean. Up front, the cockpit was staffed with a highly seasoned crew. Captain David Uwais, a former Air Force aviator with nearly 14,000 flying hours, commanded the aircraft. To his right Saturday First Officer David Hamilton, and behind them was flight engineer Giuseppe Bellagarda, both deeply familiar with the enormous 747. Two additional relief crew members were also on board for the long cruise ahead. The aircraft itself was a Combi, a special 747 configuration carrying passengers in the forward section and freight in the rear third of the main deck. As cargo handlers loaded pallets and containers into the back, nothing seemed unusual, yet later investigations would reveal that what sat in that hold might hold the key to everything. At 10:25 p.m. local time, the massive jet roared down the runway and climbed into the night. The city lights of Taipei faded behind, replaced by endless black ocean. For the first hour, everything looked perfectly normal. The crew made calm position reports to Hong Kong and Bangkok controllers while passengers enjoyed the late-night meal service. None of them could imagine that somewhere behind the last row of seats, among the stacks of freight, something was waiting to ignite a disaster unlike anything South African Airways had ever faced. As Flight 295 settled into its long cruise, the cabin lights dimmed and the passengers prepared to sleep. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was calm. The crew talked casually, reviewed fuel numbers, and waited for the quiet stretch that usually defined these overnight flights across the Indian Ocean. But below their feet, sealed behind a locked bulkhead, the main deck cargo hold carried a mixture of containers and pallets. Officially, the manifest listed electronics, fabrics, and computer components. Unofficially, some crew members had long suspected that not everything loaded onto these flights was as harmless as the paperwork claimed. South Africa, at the time, faced strict international restrictions. Its government was isolated, and its military struggled to source equipment from abroad. For years, rumors circulated within South African Airways that certain flights quietly transported sensitive cargo materials the airline could never publicly admit to carrying. Many pilots disliked this practice. Captain Uwais himself had reportedly questioned the safety of some shipments he was asked to approve. Still, on this night, there was no sign of trouble, at least not yet. Roughly 90 minutes after takeoff, Flight 295 made a routine radio call to a company communications station in Johannesburg known as ZUR Dock. This station monitored SA flights around the world, keeping in touch even when they were out of range of normal air traffic control. The call was uneventful, but what happened to the recording of that conversation would later become one of the great mysteries of this disaster. Back in the cabin, the last meal trays were cleared. The hum of 4 engines filled the silence as the aircraft pushed southward, skirting restricted airspace and tracing a long arc around Southeast Asia. For the passengers, it was just a normal flight. Yet somewhere behind them, deep within the cargo section, conditions were slowly shifting. and by the time the first warning reached the cockpit, the danger would already be far beyond anything the crew had ever trained for. Hours passed as Flight 295 crossed the open ocean, its lights barely visible against the endless black sky. Most passengers were asleep, unaware that the quiet calm inside the cabin was about to shatter without warning. In the cockpit, the crew's voices were relaxed as they discussed routine matters. Then, suddenly, an alarm pierced the silence. A smoke detector in the main deck cargo area had triggered. At first, the pilots reacted with the practiced calm of professionals. Smoke warnings can sometimes be false, caused by electrical glitches or harmless fumes. But within seconds, the truth became clear. The flight engineer noticed circuit breakers popping one after another, a sign that something was burning through electrical lines. This was no false alert. The crew immediately began working through the fire procedures, scanning instruments, isolating systems, and trying to determine exactly where the fire was spreading. The indications all pointed to the same location, the cargo pallets directly behind the passenger cabin. As they worked, the tone in the cockpit shifted from routine to urgent. They had trained for many emergencies, but an onboard fire is one of the most lethal situations a crew can face. Fires inside aircraft grow uncontrollably fast, often giving crews less than 20 minutes before the structure becomes compromised. With smoke alarms sounding and electrical systems failing, the captain knew they had only one option: get the aircraft on the ground as fast as possible. But then came the strangest twist. The cockpit voice recorder captured the crew discussing dinner earlier in the flight, a conversation that should have taken place hours before the emergency. Yet those recordings somehow appeared on the final 30 minutes of the tape, right before power to the recorder failed. Something wasn't adding up. Either the fire began far earlier than official reports claimed, or there was another event, one never recorded, never acknowledged, that had occurred long before the pilots radioed for help. And as the smoke thickened behind the cockpit door, Flight 295 was heading toward a disaster no one could yet see. With the smoke alarm blaring, the captain prepared to declare an emergency. But something unexpected happened. The fire indication flickered, then briefly disappeared. It was as if the system itself was struggling to stay alive. Flickering warnings are never a good sign. They usually mean the fire has already begun destroying electrical cables. The crew pressed on. They attempted to activate fire suppression procedures, but the Boeing 747 Combi lacked a fully equipped cargo fire extinguishing system on the main deck. That meant the fire was essentially free to grow unless the crew could isolate airflow and starve it of oxygen. But fighting a hidden fire miles above the ocean is like trying to put out a blaze in a sealed basement. You can't see it, you can't reach it, and you have no idea how big it has become. Meanwhile, smoke began creeping into the passenger cabin. A faint smell at first, then an unmistakable edge drifting through the air vents. Flight attendants hurried forward to report the situation to the cockpit. One of them mentioned seeing passengers coughing and covering their faces with towels. The captain now had no doubt this was a fully developed cargo fire. He directed the first officer to contact Mauritius, the nearest place they had any hope of reaching. But they were still hundreds of miles away, and descending through the night sky would take precious time they might not have. While they began the emergency descent, another issue emerged, one that deepened the mystery surrounding this flight. The cockpit suddenly fell silent on the recorder, not because the pilots stopped speaking, but because the recorder itself lost power. The fire had burned through the wiring, feeding it. Whatever happened next would never be captured on tape. And yet the pilots continued flying, continued communicating, and continued fighting for their aircraft. But with each minute that passed, the blaze behind the cabin was gaining strength, eating its way through metal, cables, and oxygen lines. Flight 295 was now in a race it could not afford to lose. As the crew fought to control the situation, the passengers were facing a terrifying reality of their own. Smoke thickened through the aisles, turning the once quiet cabin into a scene of confusion. Flight attendants moved fast, urging people to stay calm while guiding them toward the front, away from the cargo section where the fire was raging unseen. Some passengers wrapped clothing over their mouths. Others sat frozen, gripping armrests as the aircraft began a rapid descent. The nose of the 747 dipped, engines roaring louder than before, a sign that the crew was pushing the aircraft as fast and as low as they safely could. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the flight engineer was desperately checking systems. One by one, key instruments began to fail. Screens flickered, gauges froze, warning lights died. The fire was burning through the backbone of the aircraft's wiring, cutting off essential tools the pilots needed to navigate in total darkness. Still, the captain managed to contact Mauritius, his voice controlled but strained. He requested a full emergency response. Fire crews, ambulances, everything. But reaching Mauritius was uncertain. The aircraft's altitude was dropping quickly. And with each passing mile, the internal temperature near the cargo bay climbed higher. The crew attempted to seal off the cargo area, hoping to slow the spread of flames, but the heat was already forcing its way through the dividing structure. At least one flight attendant attempted to enter the cargo zone with a fire extinguisher, but the moment they opened the hatch, the intensity forced them back. They dropped the extinguisher without even pulling the trigger. The fire had already grown too large to fight manually. In the front cabin, the situation turned desperate. Some passengers were already succumbing to fumes, slumping in their seats. The air was becoming toxic, filled with carbon monoxide and burning chemicals. The clock was running out. And the pilots knew it. Every second mattered now. But the biggest challenge was still ahead, because the aircraft's systems were failing faster than they could manage, and the fire behind them was no longer just a threat. It had become an unstoppable force. The situation inside Flight 295 grew increasingly dire. Smoke filled the cabin, choking passengers and crew alike. The front of the aircraft was now crowded with terrified travelers, all desperate to escape the thickening hatch coming from the cargo section. Some passengers were already showing signs of carbon monoxide poisoning, slumping in their seats despite efforts to stay conscious. In the cockpit, the pilots were fighting a losing battle. Essential instruments were failing one by one as the fire burned through critical wiring. The artificial horizon flickered, navigation screens went dark, and even communication systems became unreliable. With the aircraft still hundreds of miles from Mauritius, the captain faced a nearly impossible choice: attempt an immediate, risky landing far from prepared emergency services, or push onward, hoping to reach the airport in time. Flight attendants tried to control the chaos, moving through the aisles and guiding passengers toward the front. One braved the smoke-filled cargo door with a fire extinguisher but quickly realized the blaze was too intense. The extinguisher dropped from their hands unused. The fire had already grown beyond human control. As the 747 descended rapidly, the combination of toxic fumes, extreme heat, and failing systems turned the cabin into a nightmare. The engines roared, the wind rushed past open vents, and the aircraft shuddered under the stress of its emergency maneuvers. Every second counted, and the crew knew that the main threat, the ragging fire in the cargo, was relentless and unstoppable. The clock was ticking. Flight to 95 was now a race against time, fire, and mechanical failure. The pilots and crew had done everything they could, but the inferno behind them was about to decide the final outcome. By early morning, Flight to 95 was still airborne, but the aircraft was severely weakened. The fire in the cargo hold had become uncontrollable, spreading heat, smoke, and toxic gases throughout the cabin. Passengers clung to their seats, some unconscious, others coughing violently, struggling to breathe as the smoke thickened. In the cockpit, Captain Uvias and his crew were racing against time. Instruments had failed one by one, and navigation was now almost entirely visual, but there was nothing to see over the dark, endless ocean. The co-pilot shouted instructions over the roar of wind and failing engines. Every system that might have helped them survive was failing. The fire, fueled by unknown cargo, had begun to compromise the aircraft's structural integrity. Heat warped panels and weakened wiring, making control increasingly difficult. The pilots fought desperately to maintain control, steering toward Mauritius while battling overwhelming smoke and exhaustion. Down in the cabin, flight attendants continued to guide the passengers forward. Some had collapsed, others barely conscious, but they pushed everyone to the front, hoping to distance them from the inferno ragging behind. Attempts to fight the fire manually had long failed, even the onboard extinguishers had been rendered useless. The situation was now catastrophic. Flight to 95 was no longer just fighting a fire, it was struggling against the total collapse of the aircraft itself. Every moment in the sky brought new challenges, instruments failing, oxygen running low, passengers at risk of carbon monoxide poisoning, and the inferno behind them spreading without restraint. The pilots and crew had done everything humanly possible. But in the silent hours over the Indian Ocean, the aircraft was reaching a point of no return. The final moments were approaching, and the question remained, would Flight to 95 ever make it to land, or would the fire consume everything first? As Flight to 95 neared Mauritius, the situation became hopelessly desperate. The cargo fire had intensified beyond anything the crew could control. Heat radiated through the fuselage, smoke filled the cockpit, and instruments flickered in and out, leaving the pilots with almost no reliable information. The captain fought to keep the aircraft level, using every ounce of skill and experience to guide the plane toward the distant runway. Visibility was nearly zero outside, only darkness and the endless ocean greeted them. Inside, panic had spread. Passengers clutched their loved ones, some unconscious from smoke inhalation, others terrified, praying for a miracle. Attempts to contain the blaze had failed entirely. One flight attendant had tried to fight the fire directly in the cargo hold but had been forced back by the overwhelming heat. Extinguishers lay unused, their contents insufficient to slow the inferno. The pilots were faced with an impossible choice: continue toward Mauritius with a failing aircraft or attempt an emergency ditching in the open ocean, thousands of feet above the water. Each second brought more structural damage as the fire consumed critical wiring, weakening control surfaces and vital systems. The engines roared and shuddered under strain, vibrations running through the cabin. Smoke choked both passengers and crew, making every decision harder. Even basic communication between pilots required shouting, straining their lungs through the hatch. With the runway still over 100 miles away, Flight 295 became a race against time, fire, and the limits of human endurance. Every maneuver was critical, every decision life or death. And yet, despite their heroism, it was clear that the aircraft itself was failing faster than the crew could react. The final moments of Flight 295 were now dangerously close. By the early hours of the morning, Flight 295 was in its final struggle. The fire in the rear cargo hold had destroyed vital electrical systems, leaving the pilots nearly blind to instruments and nearly deaf to the roar of engines and wind. The aircraft trembled under the stress, metal groaning as the intense heat weakened its structure. Passengers were trapped in the smoky cabin, many unconscious from carbon monoxide poisoning. Flight attendants fought to keep them moving forward, but panic and exhaustion made every step a struggle. The cabin was filled with thick, choking smoke, visibility was almost zero, and the inferno behind them continued to spread relentlessly. The captain and crew made one final attempt to reach Mauritius. They pushed the 747 into a steep descent, hoping to buy precious time and distance. Every control input was a fight against the heat-warped fuselage, every turn a challenge as the aircraft groaned and shuddered. Then, in a horrifying instant, the fire reached a point of no return. Critical systems failed completely. The weakened structure could no longer withstand the stresses of flight. Metal twisted, panels buckled, and with a sickening roar, the massive aircraft began to break apart mid-air. Flight 295 crashed into the Indian Ocean in 3 pieces. Waves swallowed the fuselage almost immediately, sending wreckage to the depths below. There were no survivors. The world would later learn that 140 passengers and 19 crew had perished. Investigators later found that the fire had burned at extreme temperatures, well over 1,000 degrees Celsius, suggesting highly combustible materials were involved. Yet the exact cause of the blaze, and the true nature of the cargo, remains a mystery to this day. Flight 295 had become one of aviation's most tragic and puzzling disasters, leaving behind questions that may never be fully answered. The aftermath of Flight 295's crash shocked the world. Wreckage was later recovered from the depths of the Indian Ocean, but much of the main cargo and critical components were lost, making it almost impossible to determine the exact cause of the fire. Investigators noted that the blaze had burned at extremely high temperatures, far hotter than ordinary materials could produce. The official inquiry suggested a cargo fire in the rear hold, but details about what was inside that front right pallet remained inconclusive. Some documents hinted at electronics and lithium batteries, but experts believed that alone could not explain such an intense blaze. Rumors and conspiracy theories swirled, including speculation that sensitive or prohibited materials were secretly on board. Another mystery added to the intrigue: recordings from the airline's Johannesburg Communications Outpost, ZUR, which might have clarified the timeline of events, had vanished. Why they disappeared, and whether they held critical information, has never been revealed. Flight 295 remains a cautionary tale in aviation history, a stark reminder of how quickly a fire on board can escalate, how fragile even a massive aircraft can be in extreme conditions, and how human decisions in emergencies can have life-or-death consequences. Though decades have passed, questions still linger. What exactly caused the fire? Was there something dangerous hidden in the cargo? And could more lives have been saved if different decisions were made in those critical hours? Today, Flight 295 is remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a story of courage, desperation, and the haunting mysteries that sometimes follow the skies. Its legacy lives on in lessons learned, in aviation safety improvements, and in the stories that continue to puzzle historians, investigators, and aviation enthusiasts worldwide.